In 1985, a mother and two of her daughters were brutally slain in their home. It would take over 20 years and 3 trials before their perpetrator would be brought to justice. In the spring of 1985, in North Carolina, in the small town of Fayetteville, a place where family left their doors unlocked, children played freely in their front yards, neighbors watched out for one another. It was also home to Captain Gary Eastburn and his wife, Katie, and their 3 little girls, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Aaron, and 22-month-old Jana. On May 7th, 1985, Gary kissed his family goodbye and boarded a plane to England. He was heading overseas for a temporary training assignment with the Air Force, leaving Katie to care for the children. It was not unusual for him to be gone, but this time, fate had something unspeakable awaiting. Since the Eastburn family was planning to relocate to England so that Gary could take up a job in the Air Force, Katie had made arrangements to rehouse the family's dog, Dixie. She had placed an ad in the paper to find a new home for Dixie. Within a few days, a man named Timothy Henses, 27-year-old Army sergeant from a nearby Fort Bragg, showed up at her door to take the dog. Their interaction was brief, ordinary, at least on the surface. Neither Katie nor her daughters could have known this was the beginning of the end. By May 10th, the newspapers began to pile up at the end of the Eastburn's driveway. A neighbor, Catherine Strickland, began to feel some type of ache in her stomach. She immediately thought that something was not right. The following day, on May 11th, a silence filled the Eastburn home. No one had seen Katie and the girls. The blinds were drawn. Katie also did not respond to her husband, Gary's routine calls. The neighbors could no longer ignore the signs. They called the police to request a welfare check. When the officers stepped into the Eastburn's home, the stench was immediate. Upstairs, they found Katie in her bedroom, unclothed from the waist down, brutally and dentally assaulted, and stabbed 15 times. Just down the hall, their 5-year-old Kara was found stabbed repeatedly in the chest. Their 3-year-old Aaron bludgeoned and stabbed multiple times, from her chest to her back. Incredibly, the 22-month-old was still alive in her crib, weak but clinging to life after being left for days without food and water. She had survived what her mother and sister could not. The sight shocked even hardened investigators. This was not just a slaying, it was a massacre. While combing in the home, the investigators found fingerprints and hair, and they put it into a tube for it to be considered for evidence. After returning home, Gary helped the investigators identify the missing items, including envelopes, cash, Katie's ATM cards, and a piece of paper containing her ATM password. Investigators began the crime happening between the hours of 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3 a.m. on May 10th. The detectives, desperate to find the perpetrator, even turned a baby, Jana, the only survivor, to see if there was clues she could offer. They brought in child psychologists just to question her and show her pictures of her family and a police photo lineup. According to her summary, the report, she was not certain that Jana had seen what happened that night, but had clearly heard something Still, it was nothing that could conclusively help the investigation. Although baby Jana could not help in the days after the crime, the police found someone who could. A young man came forward and said that he saw a white male leaving the Eastburns home at about maybe 3:30 that morning. A tall white man dressed in jeans and a knit cap and a black members-only jacket exiting the Milburn's driveway, carrying a garbage bag. In the early morning hours of May 10th, the man drove away in a white Chevrolet. The investigators also found a bloody sneaker print at the scene. The witness helped the police to create a composite sketch of the suspect. The detective soon learned of a dog adoption and focused on Timothy Hennis. And on May 15th, just 3 days after the bodies were discovered, Hennis was arrested and charged with indecent assault and 3 counts of slaying. On May 15th, just 3 days after the bodies were discovered, Hennis was arrested and charged with indecent assault, 3 counts of slaying, and in 1986, a jury convicted him and he was sentenced to end of life penitentiary. But the case would not end there. In 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the conviction, ruling that the jury had been unfairly swayed by the graphic scene evidence and the photographs. At his second trial in 1989, Henris was acquitted. He walked free. He returned to the Army and went on to serve honorably, even retiring as a Master Sergeant in 2004. For years, it seemed as if the Eastburn case might have never been brought to justice. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced. In 2006, investigators retested the male DNA evidence preserved from the crime scene. The results were chilling. The DNA belonged to Timothy Hennis. Though the Fifth Amendment double jeopardy clause prohibits retrials after acquitted, the United States Constitution dual sovereignty doctrine allowed the defendant tried and acquitted in the court to be retried at the federal court level. In addition, the Uniform Code for Military Justice permits military personnel tried in a civil court to be court-martialed. And at the request of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant General John R. Vines, the commanding officer at Fort Bragg, agreed to recall the retired Hennis back into service as a preset for charging him with the Eastburn case based on new DNA evidence on September 26, 2006. Hennis was recalled to military duty and returned to Fort Bragg, and following a month acquitted his job. In August 2004, the commander of the 8th Airborne Corps ordered that Hennis be court-martialed on 3 counts of premeditated slaying. And in April of 2008, in May, Henris appealed against the court-martial decision at the United States Army Court of Justice Appeal, but it was dismissed. The following month, in September, Hennis appeared to the United States Court of Appeal for the armed sources, but this was dismissed. And in December 2009, Henris appealed against the court-martial at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of North Carolina, but this was also rejected. My goodness. In March 2010, Henris court-martial at Fort Bragg began on March 17, 2010, and lasted for 3 weeks. For the court-martial, Henris enlisted the service of military lawyer Frank Spinner, and 2 ununiformed lawyers. The prosecution was represented by Army Captains Matt Scott and Nathan Huff. Colonel Patrick Parrish presided over the court-martial proceedings, while a jury panel of 14 military officers and non-mission personnel was convened. During the trial, the prosecution focused on the DNA evidence with the prior eyewitness accounts. Spencer's defense team argued that the footprint, blood, and hair samples found at the crime scene be not matched with Henry's or the victim's. In addition, they suggested that the crime scene evidence at the former Eastburn family home in Fangville had been contaminated. In response to the DNA evidence, Spinner suggested that Hennis had consensual intercourse with Katie before her end. Hennis himself denied having ever had intercourse with Katie, consensual or otherwise. Following 3 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found that he was guilty. And on April 3rd, 2010, the jury convicted him once again. And on April 8th, 2010, he was sentenced again to the end of life penalty. Hennis remains on the capital punishment roll in Kansas. Baby Jana, the only survivor, grew up with the knowledge that she was spared while her mother and sisters were taken in a brutally unimaginable way.